What was supposed to become a last-minute trade deal between the United States and Canada has instead turned into a fresh trade war. After 3 days of intense negotiations, Washington and Ottawa failed to reach an agreement. And now, President Donald Trump's 50% tariffs on a range of Canadian goods have taken effect. Canada's response? Prime Minister Mark Carney says Ottawa will hit back dollar for dollar. This is a dramatic escalation between two countries whose economies are deeply intertwined, and it could put the future of North America's biggest trade relationship under even more pressure. So, what exactly went wrong? Just days ago, there was genuine optimism that Trump and Carney were close to a deal. Trump had actually delayed the 50% tariffs by 3 days to give negotiators more time. Both sides were talking intensely in Washington, and at one point, Trump suggested that a deal was effectively within reach. Canada's government also acknowledged that substantial progress had been made. But the optimism collapsed at the final hurdle. Canada ultimately suspended the negotiations and ordered its negotiating team to return to Ottawa. Carney said last-minute changes to the American proposal were unfair and uneconomic, and raised questions about whether any eventual agreement could be trusted. Washington tells a very different story. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer accused Canada of refusing to finalize terms that Washington believed had already been agreed earlier in the week. Greer said the United States had offered Canada what he described as the best treatment of any major exporter entering the American market. He said Washington had also offered significant tariff reductions on Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber. The proposed arrangement reportedly went beyond tariffs. Washington wanted greater cooperation with Canada on export controls, digital trade, critical minerals, airspace supply chains, and efforts to prevent goods from being rerouted through either country to avoid tariffs. The US also said the package could have paved the way for formal negotiations to renew the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. But Canada wasn't prepared to accept the final terms, and that is where the tariff deadline became reality. The United States has now imposed a 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian products. Depending on how the affected goods are measured, Canadian officials have also referred to roughly $28 billion in exports covered by the measures. Importantly, this does not mean every Canadian product entering the United States suddenly faces a 50% tariff. The affected goods represent only about 5% of Canada's annual exports to the United States. But the political and economic consequences could be considerably larger. The products affected include a wide range of Canadian goods, from construction materials and furniture to consumer products and other manufactured items. And Canada isn't simply going to absorb the hit. Mark Carney has promised retaliation. He says Canada will match the American measures dollar for dollar in order to protect Canadian workers and businesses. That means American exporters could soon face equivalent Canadian tariffs on selected US goods. And this is where the dispute becomes much more serious. Because the United States and Canada aren't distant trading partners. They are deeply integrated economies. Last year, the two countries traded around $880 billion in goods and services. Nearly 72% of Canada's goods exports go to the United States. For Canada, therefore, the US market is enormously important. But America also relies heavily on Canadian supplies, raw materials, and components. Industries across both sides of the border have spent decades building integrated supply chains. A Canadian component can cross into the United States, be processed, sent back to Canada, and cross the border again before the final product is sold. Tariffs can disrupt that entire chain, and companies ultimately have to decide who absorbs the additional cost: the exporter, the importer, or the consumer, often some combination of all three. That means this dispute isn't simply about politicians arguing over trade policy. It could eventually affect businesses, workers, manufacturers, and consumers on both sides of the border. And there is another major casualty: USMCA. The North American Trade Agreement was designed to provide stability and predictable market access between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. But the latest confrontation is raising fresh questions about the future of that framework. The two countries were already preparing for difficult discussions over the agreement. Now, instead of negotiating from a position of cooperation, Washington and Ottawa are heading into those talks after another major tariff confrontation. That makes the road ahead considerably harder. For Carney, this is also about something bigger than one tariff package. The Canadian Prime Minister has acknowledged that America has changed. and he has warned that Canada cannot simply return to the old relationship with Washington. Instead, Ottawa wants to strengthen its domestic economy and diversify its trading relationships. That could mean Canada looking more aggressively toward Europe, Asia, and other international markets to reduce its dependence on the United States. But that is easier said than done. The geographic reality doesn't change. Canada shares an enormous border with the world's largest economy. Its infrastructure, industries, and supply chains are deeply connected to America. Replacing that relationship won't happen overnight, so both sides have a lot to lose, and yet neither appears willing to back down right now. Washington says Canada walked away from a favorable deal. Ottawa says the United States changed the terms at the last minute. Two completely different versions of how the negotiations collapsed. And with talks now suspended, there is no immediate new negotiating timetable. That is particularly worrying for businesses that need certainty. They don't simply need to know what today's tariff is. They need to know what the rules will be next month, next year, and when the next USMCA negotiations begin. Instead, they now have another layer of uncertainty. And there is a political dimension to all of this. Trump has repeatedly argued that America's trading relationships should deliver more benefits to American workers. His administration views tariffs as leverage, a way of forcing trading partners to make concessions. Canada, meanwhile, is trying to demonstrate that it will not simply accept whatever terms Washington puts on the table. Carney's dollar-for-dollar response is therefore both an economic measure and a political signal. It tells Washington that Canada is prepared to retaliate rather than surrender, but retaliation creates its own risks. If America imposes tariffs and Canada responds with tariffs, American and Canadian companies can face higher costs on both sides. And if those costs continue, the dispute could spread beyond the products currently targeted. That is why this latest confrontation matters, even though the affected Canadian exports represent only a fraction of total bilateral trade. The bigger question is whether this becomes a temporary negotiating tactic, or the beginning of a much deeper restructuring of North American trade. For now, the answer is unclear. The immediate reality is straightforward. Trump's 50% tariffs are in force. Canada has suspended trade negotiations. Carney has promised dollar-for-dollar retaliation. And two countries that traded roughly $880 billion last year are once again facing a major economic confrontation. What happens next could determine much more than the price of Canadian goods in American stores. It could determine whether Washington and Ottawa can still maintain the deeply integrated trade relationship that has defined North America for decades. Because this time, the issue isn't simply about tariffs, it's about trust. And after this latest breakdown, that may be the most expensive thing for both sides to rebuild.